evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. So welcome to Second Home. I see everyone is a member, so not much to say. You already know the space.
Giovanna's not.
Okay, well, welcome to Second Home.
I've been in
So, okay, perfect. So you already know it's a co-working space. We also work as a cultural venue. So what you're going to see here tonight is an example of what we do as a cultural venue. So tonight's talk is going to be introduced by Dr. Joy Wiggins. So if you don't know her, Dr. Wiggins has a PhD in Language, Education, and Society from The Ohio State University, where she focused on cultural identity and social justice in education. She's also a TEDx speaker, and she is a co-author of the book From Sabotage to Support, a New Vision of Feminist Solidarity in the Workplace. Her books are going to be available after the talk, if you want to talk to her about that. She's a former teacher at the University of Texas and Western Washington University, and corporate DEI content and research led at Jones Lang LaSalle? Is that how you say it?
Yes, like JLL, Jones
Okay.
Lang LaSalle.
Perfect. She's the global CEO of Joy Wiggins, PhD, Equity and Inclusion Consulting. She has over 20 years of experience working with Fortune 500 companies, universities, and executive teams. And she's a specialist in cross-cultural communication, DEI strategies, gender equity, and leadership development. So Dr. Joy has done a lot. So tonight she's going to be teaching you how to deal with changes through different cultures. So I think we can learn a lot from her. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, I don't want to trip on this. I don't know that I need this. Do y'all think I need this? If I take it out, can you still hear me?
It's better with.
It's better with, okay. Okay, well, thank you for coming. And this is my first Second Home event. So I just moved to Portugal in August. So I realized, I was like, I don't really know a ton of people yet. So I just kind of spammed all the people I do know here in Lisbon. So thanks y'all for coming. This is my daughter Ruby, just in case you want to know. She's 14. And so anyway, I will, we do have a photographer, so just, maybe just ignore it if that's okay. And also I'm just filming me, not anybody else. I want to be very mindful of privacy. Okay, so I have, that's me. And, oh, it's just going to stay on me. Okay, so I was a former yoga instructor, and so what I'd like for y'all to do to kind of stay in the room and to be present is to close your eyes for a minute. And we're just going to do some simple breathing, because sometimes with this topic of change, breathing is very helpful. So if you don't mind just closing your eyes for a moment and imagining that breath coming in through your nose, going over the crown of your head, and that breath is going down to your belly, expanding your belly. And as your breath moves up from the belly, out through the lungs, just watch it as it goes, and then inhaling. So allowing that breath to come up in through the nose, down the crown of the spine, expanding your belly, and then your belly contracts, and it pushes the air up through the lungs and out through the nose. And so every moment that you're inhaling, you're breathing in vitality and energy. Every exhale, you're letting go of anything you don't need, anything that doesn't serve you, and any negativity. Just crap. Just get that out. So 2 more breaths. Inhale, and then try to remain present and calm, because I'm going to take you through a couple of little ideas around change, and so sometimes that can bring up things. So coming back to your breath every time. Okay, well, last final breath. Okay. All right, you can open your eyes. So I do that a lot because the subjects that I talk about can be quite intense. So I'm from the United States, so most of my training came from anti-racism, and so I did a lot of facilitation around anti-racism, gender equity. Things are really sensitive topics. I would lead conversations around how to have race-based conversations. So it's a really tough topic. So what I've tried to do is to really make sure that we bring that breath in and that we also extend grace to one another. So as we talk about things, trying to sort of suspend judgment, although that's difficult because we all judge and that's what human beings do. But as you talk to the people around you, just trying to come at it from curiosity and be thinking through, like, how do I, instead of maybe judging this person and categorizing all the things that I'm hearing, how do I just listen with curiosity? And also to yourselves. How do you listen to yourselves with curiosity rather than judgment? And we can be our worst critics, right? Our negative self-talk can really take us over the edge. So as we talk about this idea of change, come back to that belly breathing. Okay? How do y'all feel? Do you feel a little bit better? Yeah, it's something really nice. Here at Second Home, we also have meditation and yoga classes that you can take, so those are nice. Okay, so we're going to talk about change. And I'm going to give you a story about when I first experienced change, is when I was a kid. And my dad was in the military, and we moved every 2 or 3 years. So we were constantly moving, constantly moving. You would get settled one place, and then my dad all of a sudden would say, okay, we got to go. And we'd all pack up our boxes, the movers would come, pack us up, we'd go someplace else. So we lived in Texas. I was born in Texas, Indiana, Virginia, Germany. As an adult, I lived in Seattle, Washington, and I lived in China, and now I live here. And I was constantly moving, even as an adult. And so, have y'all ever heard that term, third culture kids? Well, it's like you have 3 spaces, right? You have your home culture, which is maybe where you grew up. For me, that was the United States and Texas. And then you have the host culture. So when I was living in Germany or China, that was my host culture. And then you create this third space, which you're neither here nor there, right? So you're not necessarily at home, but you're not necessarily, I wasn't a German citizen either. So I had this like third space. And so they call those third culture kids. And a lot of them are diplomats' kids, ambassadors' kids. They could come from anywhere, right, where there's just constant moving. So it's a really interesting thing. And one of the things that comes out of third culture kids is that they become a cultural chameleon. And they learn how to adapt to the power in the room. So my friend and I from Japan wrote a piece, an article about being a cultural chameleon and how to like navigate power dynamics. And so whenever we were new kids, her dad was in the military too, whenever we were new kids, we would come into the room, and I remember my sisters and I all did this, where we would be like, all right, what is everybody wearing? Okay, what do they look like? Who's everybody gravitating towards? That's the person to either stay away from or go to, right? Because they could be the bully, or they could be like a genuinely nice person. And so I remember just like kind of always surveying a room. And that was really important for your survival, especially middle school and high school. Like it's really important, right, to be able to survey. So if you all ever think about a change that you've been through, you probably want to find out, how do I navigate this change? Especially like I have clients right now that have merging teams. And I'm actually giving a talk in May about how they can navigate this change because they're not getting along. And for instance, there was one person that said the Romanians are always late. And that really bothered the Romanians, that they were, I think it was the Germans that were saying this. And so they were like, hey, don't say stuff like that. And so she's like, hey, can you come in and talk to our people about not pigeonholing everybody and stereotyping people? So what I'd like for you all to do is to think of a time when change was difficult and then when it was manageable. And then what were the differences? Like, what were the key differences? So, and I'd like for you to discuss that with the person next to you. So introduce yourself. This will be interactive, so you will have to talk to people. You don't have to, I suppose you could talk to yourself, but it's more helpful if you talk to the people around you. So choose someone to talk to. You can have 3 people, although I think we're even. So you're thinking about a time when change was difficult and when it was manageable. So I'll give you a quick example. I forgot to do that. I moved to China when I was 25. And I remember I couldn't find a job in Seattle. So I was like, oh God, what am I going to do? So I saw this, I was working at the university, and I saw this thing that said, move to China. And I was like, I guess I'm moving to China. So I took the flyer off and I was like telling my family and my boyfriend at the time, who did not appreciate that. And I was like, I'm leaving for China for a year. I leave in 2 months. And I had to do all these classes. And I remember that feeling of going, oh my God. Everybody thought I was crazy because this was back in 2000. So China wasn't really open to a lot of people yet. And it had been open for a little while, but not for that long. There wasn't a ton of people. I was going to a small town of 1 million, I think. It was considered a small town. And I remember riding my bike through the streets going, oh my God, what am I doing? This is so stupid. And I could have found a job in the States. I could have lived a comfortable life, would have been fine. And I just remember that like, ooh. So, but then once I got there, there was a lot of roller coasters, right? There was a lot of culture shock. There was a lot of all that stuff. But I just remember that breath work, but also I just remember trying to roll with it. So think of a time that you had a major change, and it could be that it was your choice or it was not your choice. So you get to choose kind of what time you want to talk about, but think of a time that you had a major change in your life. What made it manageable, what made it difficult, and what were the differences? Okay, talk amongst yourselves.
So when was the time you had a cultural change or something?
I just shared China.
No, I knew that, but I thought, God, I'm not going.
But like what's made it manageable, I don't know if it's like different situations that make like two situations that are both challenging, one was manageable. But I think this one kind of has because it's like depending, I guess, on the like sometimes it's like in the beginning
I could have my daughter be an extra person.
Okay.
being surrounded by people providing things that make me more
Ruby.
connected to myself and growing and like just that kind of
We want people in the picture.
it's like the same situation.
Okay.
You can sit here. Right there.
Going deep and like, now I'm finding myself as a huge challenge for myself here. A huge change. So sientes más cómodo. Do you want to speak English or
Okay, if you've already shared, switch to the next person or the other person if they haven't shared yet.
Well, I think what I would say is that I'm happy around all of those transitions so I think just under a year, now it's even though I've been going back and forth already. 5 6 months. Once you feel like I've met someone, this place is everything's a culture shock.
And you feel like right during the film,
Okay, so if you can wrap up your comments. So give your final thought.
So much I liked it a lot. I got a passport and I got marriage. So yeah. But I think that every move, like you said, is growth.
Okay, y'all ready? The y'all just came out. Okay, so does anybody want to share something that was like a key difference that you saw, or something that you kind of like, oh, this was manageable, this was not? Anybody want to share one? Yeah.
Two things come to mind. One, the more practiced I am at it, I think about travel.
Mm-hmm.
Travel used to freak me out, and then I started doing a lot of it, and it's like, it's not so hard. And also, how challenging the external circumstances are.
Yes. Yeah, that has a lot to do with it. I was thinking about this morning, and I was thinking about when I was 25, when I was in China, and I was thinking, wow, I was really did not know what the hell I was doing. And I remember not knowing the language. And not knowing the language was a huge piece of it. And then also I remember just going by bakeries and stuff and going, I'm assuming that's a bakery. I don't know. And then just like, I remember also like just everything being opposite. Like this was to hail a cab. In the US, that means go away. But I guess it's the flick, right? Which way are you flicking? Where's the pressure? So I mean, I think there's things like that, the extenuating circumstances as far as like what's going on out there. Okay, anybody else? Yeah.
Yeah, I think like I ended up listening to two people, and what I could connect is having somebody to help you or not. I moved to China also when I was around 25, and for me it was easier than when I moved here being 29, because in China I already had friends.
Oh, yeah.
Who would show me around who I was working with. Here I moved alone. Though I had systems set up in both places, here I moved for studies, I already had studies ready, there I already had job ready. But yeah, even in the 7th country where I live, this was like the most stressful time to move. And also in his example, it clear that like it was also very helpful to have somebody to guide us.
Yeah, yes, that does make a big difference. Glenn, did you want to?
Well, I'm thinking like it's more the difficult change is always in turmoil, like the emotional ways. Something that happens emotionally with the change. That's always difficult. Like for me, the practical stuff or moving around, that is always manageable because in time you get more experience and it's when you get. But the emotion changing or situations, that's always the most difficult for me.
Yeah, it's kind of your mindset too, right? Like how prepared am I for this particular change, or do I feel like this is a change I didn't choose? I think that has a lot to do with it too. If we didn't choose that change, you know, we have to kind of go with it. And if it's something that we actually chose, that's going to be a big difference, right? We know that we're going to go and choose to move or to take this new job or whatever it is. Okay. So when we think about cultural agility, it's the ability to adapt, communicate, and build trust across diverse cultural environments. So this idea, have y'all ever heard of this term, cultural agility? No. So yeah, I really feel like I've always liked it. I love to play with this idea of agility and cultural humility, agility, all of these things like curiosity, all of those kind of mindset or ways of being when we approach change. So it matters because it reduces this resistance to change. It also strengthens our collaboration with each other. It helps our relationships with each other. Have you all ever gone through a change with another person and you all have going through that change together? So like my ex-husband and I had a child. She's right over there. And I remember that's a bond that we'll always have. You know, just becoming parents together. No matter what our relationship is later on, that bond is always there. And the product of the bond too is helpful to see that. And always make sure the product is okay. So, you know, it also enhances leadership too in global settings. So whenever, I know that when I was working at JLL, we had a huge change where we had a brand new leader, we had a new global head, and then we also had some of the team, the older team from the old global head left. And so a new batch came in. So it was a whole bunch of new people that had come in. They had also recently had a merger. So how does culture and change intersect with each other? So our upbringing, our past experiences, how we adapted to change, how we didn't adapt to change. If you maybe were growing up and your parents maybe went through a divorce, or there was a huge upheaval of change, or perhaps you were in a country that was politically unstable and you had to leave. Those are all huge changes, right? And they can happen to us when we're at our most vulnerable, when we're children. And so then that can set the stage and the foundation for how do we adapt to change based on those feelings. And that could be maybe past trauma, or maybe it was fun, maybe it was engaging and you had a good time, or maybe it was a horrible change. And then you might be like, I don't want to change, I don't want to, you know, when everything changes, I don't want, you know, I don't want anything like that to happen. So how we react to uncertainty has a lot to do with it. How we perceive authority during the change. So I remember my dad, I actually really respected my dad. So when he said we're moving to Germany, I was like, okay. You know, I thought, okay, he's been pretty cool this whole time. I was about 8 years old. I was like, all right, he's probably got us. You know, it's probably going to be okay. And it turned out I had an amazing time. And it's probably why I'm in Portugal, because I felt like that change was a really positive change. So also our level of resistance to openness. So again, if you had a choice of whether or not you moved or not, that would be really important as well. Okay, so you have a piece of paper that has the cultural influences. And if you look at all of these different things that can influence how you move through the world, how you navigate the world, how you perceive things based on your identity, and how others perceive you. So if you look at that, you might want to think about, well, what are the top 3 of these identity, and we call them identity markers. What are the top 3 that really impact your identity right now? So for instance, for me, it's definitely my gender. Being a woman has dictated a whole lot of things. Every single day I wake up, I decide what I'm wearing. Am I going to be more masculine today, more feminine? My gender expression, all of those things. Am I going to be safe today? Do I have to think about what I'm wearing? Do I have to think about where I'm going to go or how I'm going to get there? Those are things that I have to think about as a woman. I also, now that I live in Portugal, think about my language. And I really have not been practicing Portuguese, so I probably should, but I haven't. So I think about, okay, what's the easiest way to get around today? So that, you know, when I was in the US, that didn't matter. Language didn't really matter. But where I am right now, it matters. The other thing that matters is my age. I've actually gotten a lot older. And the way I experience being older has really changed a lot, and how I'm perceived. I remember like being in 20s and 30s and not being taken seriously at work. And now I think I'm a little bit more seasoned, and but now I'm experiencing the opposite of like, I don't know technology as well, or I don't really know what I'm doing, or I'm old, or I'm a Gen Xer, so she doesn't get it. Those kinds of things that happen with age. And so there's all of these different things that can happen too. So like our income level, that determines a lot. What we're able to do, what we have access to, what opportunities we have. If you think about religion and belief system, that can really dictate how you move through the world, the interactions that you have, the interactions that you choose to have and not to have. Our family status, so like I'm a single mom, that dictates a lot too. My income and family status are really tied together. If you think about ability or geographic region, where we are. Did you all experience the earthquake? Okay, so yeah, I was on the phone with Stephanie, and she got to see my firsthand reaction to my desk moving. I go, oh my God, and I was up flying, and we were on a Zoom call, and all she could see was me gone. And then I'm upstairs looking for the cats, and then over this way. I was absolutely freaking out. Stephanie's from Colombia, and she's just like, this is no big deal. And she's looking at me like I'm nuts, but I was freaked out. I got to get my Quake bag together. You know, I was just completely unhinged. So that has a lot. Now I wouldn't have thought about that in Texas. Texas, it's tornadoes, or in tsunamis in Seattle. I guess we have tsunamis here too, though. So our political identity might even have, depending on where you're from, your political identity can have a huge impact or not. It just depends on where you are, right, in the world. Our occupation, like what do we do? I don't know if in the U.S. I find that a lot of people will say, well, what do you do? And that's kind of an obnoxious question in a way, because it's like, how are you? How are you right now? Not what do you do? It's like, how do you function in the world? So there's, depending on where you are, to these types of questions that we ask each other. So as you look around at all of these, look around and just think about which ones are the ones that are influencing you right now, that you're finding that are kind of not in your way, but they're just in your face. And feel free to share with the person next to you if you want to, or not, doesn't matter.
Being now sing along, joy, trying to practice
I would say consultation, I guess, because it's come from environmental I guess that's another one. Maybe language.
7:25.
Because if you're kind of stepping outside those lines, it's like, both classes I can, so I'm working with Joy, completely different panel. There's other things as well, and it's nice like you share that kind of anxiety that comes up, like feeling like what do I
Making an effort. Yeah.
So I think what participation for me is also one of the things. So you were saying language, information, for me the language, I don't know, Spanish has helped me a lot to understand Portuguese.
Okay, take about 1 more minute.
But I've been exposed to it for like a bit, so we were together for 10 years. I'm in your time, like almost 4 years. I learned Portuguese by listening to her, and then I learned to read it, and then I finally learned to write it, and then also speak it. Speaking it was the hardest part.
Sorry.
I said it on the north way.
I did not cough. I know, I guess if I walk over there. Okay, so let's get back together. So one of the things this is a really interesting thing from Hofstede. Have you all ever heard of Hofstede? He is a theorist that talks about cultural dimensions and how people deal with change. And one of the things that he said was that some people that are in high context, have you ever heard this term? So high context basically means that, like when I was in China, that's a high context culture. They're not going to speak to you directly. They're not going to say, I'm pissed at you. they're going to say, I wasn't exactly encouraged by the things that you said. That was more indirect, right? And so also, I might not say something directly to someone, but I might talk around the subject, and that's more of a high context culture. And that's usually in cultures that need to establish trust and relationships first. They usually want to make sure that I can trust this person before I can actually be a little bit more direct or honest with them. Now, this is a pretty, these theories have been around for a while, but I wanted to show them because they talk about change. So there's some uncertainty avoidance. That's the degree where you feel comfortable with ambiguity. Like you're fine with change or you're not fine with change. So if you have a high uncertainty avoidance, you might not like change. And if you're on a team where you are the leader of someone that is on a high uncertainty avoidance, when big changes come around, you might want to say, okay, I'm going to give you a little bit more structured roadmap here. And we're going to think about the clear norms and values and things that we're going to do with this change. Now, somebody that's from a low context environment or low uncertainty avoidance, they thrive on flexibility. They're fine with change. They're pretty open to it. Now, these are countries, but that doesn't necessarily mean that every individual from Portugal or Japan is a high context individual. This is just kind of the pattern of which those cultures and those leaderships and those companies tend to operate. So in the US, for instance, it's a low context environment. The Americans are typically pretty direct, although sometimes it's really hard to read Americans. Sometimes we say something and it's nice and it looks nice, and then I think other people think it's fake because we're like, oh, that's a really nice presentation, and it sucked. Like, but they won't say that. So usually, though, people that are in low context cultures are really they're fine with change. They're okay with it. It's not a big deal. So they might be okay with some more flexibility and collaboration when a big change is happening. Are any of you experiencing a big change currently, like at your company or in your personal life? Anybody ever been a part of a merger of two companies together or new leadership? Okay, so you might want to think about, well, how did I feel about that? Was I uncertain about it? And again, sometimes this comes back down to choice. Did I choose to be a part of this big change, or did I have it thrust upon me? I remember my university was rebranding itself, and we were all disgusted with the stupid A. It was this big A. And they just gave it a little flick, and that was it. We're like, what is the big deal? Why did we have to rebrand every little thing to add a little flick to the A? We didn't understand it. And we weren't asked about it either. The other thing is power distance. So how many of you are part of a culture or see a hierarchy? Like you really value the leader, and you think the leader is the one, it should be a top-down approach where the leader makes the decisions with the change and it should be implemented. Anybody feel like you like that type of approach? Okay. Yeah.
Portugal is one of the countries with higher power distance.
That what?
With higher power distance index.
Yes. So actually I don't have it on there, but you're right. Yeah, it does. It has a high power distance. And then a low power distance is where they're trying to get buy-in from everybody, like even the people at the bottom of the rung. They're trying to get buy-in and collaboration, and we're all going to make this decision together. We're all going to make this change together, and you get more buy-in. How many of you prefer that type of method? How many of you are kind of in the middle? You're like, meh. If it really means a lot to me, maybe I'll collaborate. If I don't care, then I let the leader figure it out. And then social inertia is your resistance to change. So whether or not you have resistance to it. So some cultures will value resisting change more than prioritizing innovation. So they're going to stick with what's been working. Maybe it's not the most innovative, maybe it's not the most creative, but they're going to keep going with familiar rituals, like traditions and things like that. They're not going to change it for nothing. So even though maybe it's not working anymore, this thing that they're doing is not working, they don't want to change it. So that's called social inertia. They don't want to actually change it. So if you were to assess your own avoidance and to uncertainty and openness to change, how do you think your cultural background shapes this? So depending on where you're from, where you grew up, all of these social and cultural spheres of influence, how do you handle This idea of uncertainty, and do you avoid it? Do you embrace it? How do you feel? And you can share out too. Yeah.
Well, I feel like I copy always my parents, like how they deal with stuff. But I see a lot of mistakes, well not mistakes, but things I don't want to do the same as my parents. But somehow I always find like myself missing a decision of my parents. But I'm trying to change how they did or do or think.
Well, they were your models, right?
Yeah, well, that's why. But it's difficult when you see something. That is not of this age anymore, or not right. You have to change it. So, but furthermore, it's I think I don't know, just a lot of practical things. A lot of I did meditation courses. A lot of sports. I think helps. Like reading books, just hiking alone or something. Just a reflection day or something. I think more practical. It's for me help.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
I think for cultures it is like sometimes you don't choose. If you live in a country with a lot of instability, you learn to, and this is how pretty often you can say if this person is like from high or low context in terms of how easy change is for them. If they're coming, for example, from Syria, they get used to mess. If they're coming from Ukraine, we get used to mess. Like you should just learn to talk to really, and right off just knowing history of the country, you can say how hard or easy it is for them.
And that's exactly my next point, because one of the things, to be culturally agile, it's important to understand the context in which you're living. So, identifying cultural dimensions that impact, where you are, time and space, right? Like right now in Portugal, I realize that there's a high influx of immigrants coming in, and that it's straining the Portuguese system, right? Immigration, I have my immigration thing next week. I'm noticing all of this, and I also now have that perspective of an immigrant. Now I understand how confusing it all is, and how you really need to have a good support network and resources and all those things to help you. So one of the things, so I created this model, it's called the Cultural Agility Change Model, and it basically looks at context awareness, so identifying these cultural dimensions, those spheres of influence, how it impacts how change will be perceived. So knowing the people in your group, knowing the people either on your team or in your family or whoever you're around, kind of finding out how do they perceive change? What has change been like for them? And then look at the historical and political aspects of it. So right now with the US, all the things that are happening, I'm here mostly because I knew all that is happening there was gonna happen. And since I do DEI work, that's been abolished. And so now I'm here and I've pivoted. So I still have some US clients, but a lot of them are gone because they don't know this change, this whole idea of change. And it's rippling, right? It's coming, I think of it like a tsunami, that it is coming to Europe. And it's coming to affect Europe too. And it already has, right, with some of the past week, but we don't need to go into it. We can later if you want, over drinks. And then alignment and framing. So frame the change in a way that aligns with the team's cultural and personal values. So find out, who you're with in the room. So how many of you work with teams right now, like other people? Okay, how many of you are the leader of those? Okay, so you might really you're like, oh, changes are coming. I gotta prep the team. So find out from them. As you establish trust with them, you can find out, how are they with change? Do they like change? Do they not like change? Or, how will I perceive what they're gonna do with this new change that's happening? So really framing it in a way that aligns with their values. And then highlight collective or individual benefits. So ask them, this is a really important question. I was doing this with health and housing services back in Texas, and they had a lot of different personalities. And I was like, they're like, I just don't understand why this person is saying this to me. I was like, one thing you can say to somebody is, how important is this to you? Because if they're showing resistance or if they're getting upset, try to find out what's at the root of that, and then say, how important is this to you? And they could say, I don't really care that much, I'm just being a devil's advocate. Or, this part of that change matters a lot to me. I don't really care about this other stuff. And so you can get more, you can unearth a little bit more of what is the resistance. That can even be with family too. That can be with your partner. That can be with anybody. Friendships. How important is this to you? Because then you can figure out, like, is this a big priority for them? Is this like top of the heap? Or is it at the bottom and they're just kind of thinking about one little aspect? And so then you can work from there. And then the other one is communication. So are you with a high context group of people or low context? And then you might want to adjust it. There's a great tool called Gap Smooth. And have you all seen Gap Smooth? Oh, it's my favorite. I'm obsessed with it. And like obsessed with it. It's ridiculous. I will get on my phone and you can look at these videos and you can say, okay, I want to lead a presentation in Japan, or I want to negotiate with someone in India. And it will pop up a video and it'll say, this is what they value, typically at companies, if you think of it from an organizational standpoint. Typically, this is what they value. So in Japan, they might have a lot of meetings. It might be a very structured approach. They might be wanting to establish trust first and establish a relationship first before they get into, you know, the directness of it all and the details. So if you are somebody that's very direct, you might want to be cognizant of that and make sure that you understand what you're going into. And then you want to think about, is this a particular group that likes stories and they're engaged by stories, or do they want data? So when I was looking at, I have a German client and they were saying, they're very data driven, just tell them exactly what's happening, don't get fluffy, don't ever give them anything that you cannot deliver immediately. So there was something I was thinking about putting in my contract and I was like, well, I'll figure that one out. And I went to Gap Smooth and it said, do not give them something you cannot deliver immediately. And I was like, whoa, take it out. So I took it out and, you know, thank goodness I looked at, you know, I was looking at these things. And then when you're engaging somebody, think about the cultural influencers. So look at the people around you that might be somebody that's more adaptable. So look at things that have worked, people that have worked, that have been adaptable to change, and you can model after them. And then you can also provide spaces for dialogue, so trying to get that trust, again, asking people what's important to you, what matters to you. If we made this change, what would happen? How would this affect you? And then looking at sustainability. So you might want to always reinforce like cultural traditions over time. So I was part of this group at Western. It was about anti-racism. And what we were doing is we were taking the community and we were preparing them to have race-based conversations, all about race. And it was a really difficult conversation to have. So our group, as a committee, we all decided we were going to have rituals before we met every time. So we would always have like a talking stick. And we're like, okay, how are you showing up today? And then you would pass the talking stick around. How are you showing up? Oh, I'm agitated, I'm this, I'm that. And it kind of, even though it took about 10 minutes of the meeting, I remember watching the leader of the group and thinking, this is a great idea. And I started to do that with my classes and everything else because I thought, I can find out. Some of my students, when I was a professor, would look at me like this. And if I would ask them that question, how are you showing up today? They're like, I am so stressed out. And I'm like, okay, it's not me. It's not me that they're, you know, like that, looking at me like that. So I would try to do breathing with them and I would try to help establish like, hey, let's talk about the syllabus. I'm gonna give you a little bit of information now. Don't worry about that other stuff. We'll talk about it later. Because I could assess their stress level. So that's a good way to also facilitate change. So I think I'm going to pass through this, but this is an example. A U.S. tech company acquires a Japanese software firm, and the Japanese are valuing communication and hierarchy, and the U.S. team is valuing this discussion and innovation. And so sometimes it might seem like, is anything getting done? Are we making decisions here? What's happening? Like, where is this going? So establishing what's the purpose of the meeting in the very beginning is a good idea. Like, what do we want to accomplish in this meeting? Are we going to actually come to a decision, or are we just going to have a discussion? And one of the things with Gap Smooth, it said that the French like to discuss and discuss and discuss and interrupt and come back and talk about it, and sometimes the whole hour is nothing but just discussions and interruptions. And then somebody that's maybe from a low context might be like, well, where's the decision? So be thinking about too, you know, how the people might be feeling. So the Japanese might be feeling like, oh my God, they're not, you know, there's no clear leadership guidance here. What's going on? Another thing with what this was saying with Chinese is that I felt this with my students. They wouldn't say anything. When I'd ask them to interact, they would just sit there and they wouldn't interact. And I was like, okay, I gotta refigure out how to do this. And so like I would, I ended up getting like a structured dialogue for them that they could practice with each other. And that's how I got them to talk. So this is a handout that I gave to you, and this is just something for you to look at and to use. But basically it's all of these things together, and it gives you some practical tips on there. So if you look at that handout, it'll go through each of the parts of the model, and it'll tell you like what's a practical tip if you wanted to go into a communication, especially with Japan. It's a high context environment. So you might find that you need to establish trust and relationship first. I noticed that with China. Have you all ever heard the term saving face? So a lot of times this is a good story, actually, I'll just quickly. What was happening at this time, I think it was like 2001, there was a Chinese plane that hit, or a US plane and a Chinese plane collided. Now, I was told to stay home for 3 days and not to go to class. And when I did come back, my students, and I didn't hear the US version, so I had no idea. All I heard was the Chinese version of what happened. And so the Chinese thought that the US should apologize. And so I had a student that had this little sign up, I still have it. It says, US should apologize, George Bush should apologize. And I said, okay, let's talk about this. And he goes, no, and he put it back down. I was like, no, you put it up there, let's talk about it. And I was like, what do we think about this idea of apologies? What does that mean? For an American, it means that they're wrong. If you apologize, you're saying, I'm wrong. And the Chinese were like, no, we just want them to apologize for the situation that it happened. And I was like, see, that's a great example of this idea of just about apologies and what do they mean, and forgiveness and things like that. So it was a really good way to think back about it. So I wanted to establish trust with them with that conversation. I was like, well, this, and they were like, oh wow, why do the Americans think that? I'm like, I don't know, but it's just what they think. They're not going to apologize. It's just not going to happen. And so it kind of, at least, we couldn't solve the problem obviously, but it just helped us. So one of the things too is to build that psychological trust, or build trust and psychological safety. Okay, so if you were to look at this framework, what is like one thing that you think that you could take right now and apply it? Whether that be in your personal life, your professional life, just something that is a change that's going on, or even thinking back to a change that you had, what is something on there that you might want to use? And take like 2 minutes. So does anything stand out to anybody that anybody want to share?
I think I've got I am a relatively new member of staff, and therefore navigating, his personality and the job. I actually use something called Clifton Strengths, which is like a personality test. I can understand my staff better and know what works for them. So it's not a dissimilar thing, but therefore I know whether they need verbal support, or is it written support, or is it like being part of a team, or whatever makes them click. Is so that's how I try and navigate difficult scenarios or conversations around, if it's results based or whatever, it's figuring out what resonates with them and then going for it that way.
Is that the one where they have the colors? I think that's a different one. The Clifton Strengths.
It's got 70 questions that it asks, and then from that it gives you your personality type, and therefore what levers to pull for them as well as for you. It lets them. So
do you get to find out information about the other people too? Yeah. So like what their personality or what their strength is, yeah. And so then you know how to go and communicate with them. So you'll give them the information they actually want and not what you think they want.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's how they would receive information and how they want to be, rewarded and communicated with. You get a
good. Yeah, that's exactly it. And I think, when we think about being culturally agile, it's like, can we shift when we need to? So do we know ourselves well enough too? And that's really like doing a deep dive into ourselves. Like, how do we react to this kind of stuff? How am I with change? And if I'm nervous about the change, then more than likely I'm going to show that when the change is happening with my team or with my family or whoever. So it might actually like pop up like, oh my God, and I might have anxiety I didn't even know was there. What else? Anybody else want to share something?
I just like the acknowledge emotions you have written, and then at the end to say remember to breathe.
Yeah.
Because a lot of times you panic or you think too much and you think, oh, I need to do something or I need to change it. But then I just take a step back and breathe a bit, let think.
And the belly breathing is important, because if you keep it up here, it's that anxiety, it actually makes it worse. So if you take that breathing down to your belly, it kind of grounds you a little bit more. So yeah.
It's always very difficult.
Yeah, it's difficult to do, especially when you're trying to defend the change, or if you're not choosing the change, or you are the one having to give the news about the change, or you're the one receiving the change. And you're like, wait a minute, what the heck? I wasn't expecting that at all. So those are all the times that it's really important to think through all of these different aspects. Okay, let's do one more.
It's not directly related to this, it's something that happened to me today. I noticed something unpleasant happened to me, made me change my plans. But what I thought was most important was to be prepared to give away something. To give away that situation that I planned my day and my boss ruined my day. So being prepared to give away what I was about to do, so it was the most easy way to get over.
That's such a great idea. I think William Ury talks about that. He was a negotiator, and he always talked about, I think it's no, yes, no, or no, yes, no, yes. Is that right? But it's saying, yes, I want to work with you. No, I won't do that. That's a boundary. But yes, I'm willing to give you this. And so it's a yes, no, yes. And it's a really great way to negotiate with people too. So you have to think through too, like, what are you willing to give away? What are you okay with? Knowing that you're going to have to negotiate something. Is that kind of what you're talking about? Yeah. Okay, cool. Anybody else? All right. Well, so thinking through your next step. So apply one of these cultural agility strategies that work this week or with your family. And then engage with different cultural perspectives. So if there's the Clifton Strengths, or if there's Gap Smooth, or there's like a ton, there's Myers-Briggs, there's another one with the colors, and I always forget the name of it, but it's like an assessment thing. And it's like if you're a yellow, you're really extroverted, and you are somebody that like wants all the socialize first, and if you're red, you're like, don't talk to me about social stuff, just get to the point. And so, and then you can walk around and put like the little block, whatever color you are, or you could just show up at a meeting with it and put it down. I think they have it on Zoom now too. They're going to put like the colors on the Zoom boxes, so that's helpful. Okay, so any questions? Anything? How did you? Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit more? The phrase high context is new to me. Can you give a couple more examples so I have a better reference?
Yeah. So high context is where you're going to find the culture, and sometimes this has to do with the history of that culture. So it might be that they had some political instability, and so they don't really have a whole lot of trust in the government or regulations. And so the way that they communicated had to be around. They couldn't be direct because it could be violent. It could end up in some kind of violence or more instability or something. And so they had to kind of work around it. And so they don't really say exactly what they're thinking. So a high context culture is one that might be like West Africa. Sometimes there's more high context culture. I think Brazil was another example of that. And not saying that necessarily all these people have political instability, but that's usually the history has a lot to do with it. And then if the low context people are usually people that have had more very regulated, more political stability, and they don't necessarily, they're fine with rules and regulations, and they just say it like it is. And so it's a very like low context, very direct. So that's what Hofstede has talked about, and he's the theorist that some of that comes from. Does that make sense?
To add a little about the high context, there is a very good example. I think somebody who lived in Japan told me, is like when your neighbors come to you next day and they tell, oh, the music you played yesterday was beautiful. You kind of don't know if it's a compliment or if they're complaining, but you better take it as a compliment. So
Yes.
like they heard it.
So they're not saying that it was too loud or whatever, but they're kind of, and then you have to infer what, based on the knowledge that you have about that context of what that means. So like in Texas, we say, bless your heart. And it's funny because you can say, oh, bless your heart, like, oh, you poor soul, and mean it and be like, oh, this is really hard for you. Or if somebody does something wrong, or if they're kind of stupid, and you're like, oh, bless his little heart, you know, like he's just kind of doing what he can do. And, you know, and so it can be taken in lots of different ways, but it's the tone of voice, it's your body language, is a lot to do with the high context. So watching the way people move their bodies too. Yeah.
I think there is a great book by Aaron May, The Culture Map.
The culture map. Yep.
Get all the context for
Shows
this.
us a little bit about.
Yeah, the culture map is, and actually the description of this talk is culture map meets DEI. Because, it's a lot like that. Yeah.
I'd like to ask about the Hofstede study, because we are used to knowing about the culture of a country, but can you use it individually? There are questionnaires for defining your cultural traits individually?
Yeah, so GapSmooth actually does that. They take in Hofstede's theories and a couple of others, and you can go in and take a cultural profile, and it's actually quite fascinating because I felt like, well, I don't think I'm totally American, but I kind of am, but there's some aspects that I'm not. And so it was very helpful for me because my boss was American too, but we were two very different people. So it gives you kind of a cultural context, but it also gives you individual assessments. So you might not necessarily, it gives you your little icon, and then it shows, like if you're going to go and present in Japan, for instance, it'll show you on this continuum where you sit and where Japan sits. And then it'll tell you, this might be a toxic interaction. Watch out for this, and these are some solutions. Or it could say, this could be a very beneficial, even though y'all are really different, this could be a really beneficial relationship, and here's why. And so it'll give you like all these things. So that's one tool. Even if you just look up Google, you know, high context, low context, I don't know that they have an assessment necessarily just on Hofstede stuff, but GapSmooth is a really good one. And I can give you more information if you'd like.
One other theory from Charles Handy, the gods of management, which also has 4 cultural traits of people and their organizations.
And what was their name?
Charles Handy.
Charles what?
Charles Handy.
Oh, okay. I haven't heard of him. There's another one, Edward Hall, and some other people that all talk about these different things, and then learning styles too, and what your different learning styles are, because that's different, right? So you have to take in all of these things. So that's why that cultural spheres of influence is really good to look at. Like, what's my learning style? Am I neurodivergent? You know, does a lot of this have to do with my age and how I grew up and what was important to me and why I view things the way that I do? So all of those things can be really important. Yeah.
How do you keep them all in mind and stay authentic still? For example, if I have a team of like 5 people and I see all their profiles, okay, like now if I have one-to-one, I will remember to apply this and that, but then there is interaction, like I'm just presenting, I'm just chatting with somebody from Japan, and I'm the captain or whatever. Like how would, for example, for you, like you have a bunch of information about all this context and stuff, how do you apply it in real life?
Yeah. I think you kind of balance it between where that person is from and then them as an individual. So asking them, you know, I mean, I'm really forthcoming about it. Like, hey, how do you see this? Like, this is a really interesting, or I would say this to my students that wanted to talk about like really sensitive topics, like asking someone about, you know, race or gender or whatever. And I would say, oh, well, I heard this. I'm wondering if that's true for you. Do you feel that way? Or have you heard this before? Or coming at it from a curiosity standpoint rather than oh, you're from Japan, you must think this way. Because obviously that's not true, right? These are just cultural patterns. It could be completely not true for some people. And, you know, so everybody's an individual. So I would say if you can balance it out and just ask a lot of questions, and then you can always use yourself as an example. Like I did tonight, I talked about myself a lot because I can only speak from my experience. I can't really speak for anybody else, right? Or for other Americans or other women or whatever. So it's important to ask a lot of questions and have that cultural curiosity, and then try to balance it with what you have heard and see if that person can confirm that with you. Yeah.
So this doesn't have so much to do with work, it's more just an observation, having now lived in a culture that's quite different than the one that was new to me. And it has to do with having lived here for a while and gathered some evidence about what seems to be true in this culture based on my experience. But then confirmation bias starts to take over, and I start to just like see that over and over. And there's a way in which that's actually helpful, because it's like, yes, this is how it is here, it's different than what I'm used to. But there's also an inherent limitation to it, because if that's what I continue to see, especially things that are challenging for me, then it doesn't let in any information that's contradictory to that.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, so and the fact that you can be aware of your confirmation bias is really important. And that's why I used to tell my students, and I think I did this in my TED Talk too, where we talked about a ticker tape. And it's, you know, how you have the news and then you have this running headlines, it could be all the other things happening in the world. That's like your brain. And your brain is constantly, you know, making little judgments and assessments about everything around you. And if you're neurodivergent, like ADHD, like me, it's constant. Like that ticker tape is just going. So it's really taking it down and looking at like, well, wait a minute, what am I thinking right now about this group of people? Or what am I trying to latch some meaning onto that perhaps is not necessarily true? So if I think, what would be a good example? Well, like with the Chinese, it was really difficult because I thought, oh, I'm never going to get a straight answer. And then I had this Buddhist teacher that would give me straight answers all the time. I was like, well, there goes my confirmation bias. He was giving me straight answers, you know, and I was but you're trying to get along, you're trying to navigate. And so you're trying to make sense of the world that you're in so that you can figure it out, right? So it's hard. It's good to be really self-aware. I think that's the biggest thing. The more self-aware you are of your own biases and the way that your brain works and when it tries to confirm that thing, and then like, wait a minute, yes, maybe that's true sometimes, but that's not necessarily, and I'm going to be miserable if I keep attaching this judgment to every single person I interact with. So, well, I want to be mindful of your time. I'm happy to stand, I think we have some networking time, but I have this thing called the Cultural Development Club where we talk about these things all the time, and we have like a Slack channel, and we have all these different things. And we have a webinar, and we just had one last week, and it was about the DEI backlash in the U.S. and how is that affecting Europe, and how is that now? And then J.D. Vance went and did something, changes things. But anyway, that's something, that's part of what I do. So I come to organizations and I do tons of talks like this, and we just have these conversations about culture, and it's really fascinating. So hopefully y'all had a good time. Yeah, good. Thank you. I'm going to turn this off. And then I think we all, if you haven't had your drink yet, you can have your drink.